episode of Thoughts and Discourses on Digital Transformation. I want to welcome my next guest, Shawn Gorrell. Shawn works at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and I've known Shawn for several years. And even though we were distant, we used to bump into each other at conferences and had some great conversations. So hopefully today this will just be another fantastic conversation. So welcome, Shawn. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Shawn Gorrell from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and I'm a principal technology architect. So I've been in IT, primarily in the development space for coming up on 30 years. Wow. So,
And
across a ton of different platforms.
yeah, and you're probably one of the few people that have been impacted by COVID because you're actually a long-term kind of remote employee. So can you talk a little bit about how you work today and maybe what has changed and what has impacted you during this remote cycle for everybody now that it's like a year for most companies being remote?
It's actually better for me because I'm as you said, like I've been a remote for a long time. I'm coming up on 11 years of that. And one of the great thing for me is it's accelerated the pace of the technology tools that make this better. Because so before it, a lot of the times I'd be the odd person out. Everybody was in a room somewhere, and I'd be the one on a bridge, and that wasn't always the best experience for me as the remote. But so really, COVID kind of like leveled that playing field. It accelerated the pace of the collaboration tools. So it's made things better for me. In some ways, it's been harder when all these people that hadn't done it that way show up to the party, and the struggles with the tools and how to use them. And then one of the things I kind of noticed was how people had this tendency to try to recreate the office in this space. And that doesn't always work very well. And it doesn't always really serve us particularly well.
Yeah, and I think actually having a level playing field is probably very good for everybody because, being on the other side of that, when we were in the office and people were working from home as part of a normal routine, it was sometimes very awkward to remember to include them. Now that everybody's remote, I think actually you get actually an overall better experience for everybody and it becomes a lot more inclusive because you're aware that nobody's actually around the table.
Right. Yeah, and I used to because and when I was previously remote, is you'd have a wide range of experiences. Is some people were thoughtful about the inclusion of remotes and making sure they passed the talking stick and said, "Hey, you on the phone or you're on the bridge, do you have something to say?" And other times where they completely just forgot about you. But one of the things I'm wondering, and I think a lot of us are wondering this as we start to shift back to the office, are we going to go back to that way, or are people going to, reimagine, like use the tools? Are we going to use some of these same collaboration tools, but when we're in rooms and distributed?
Yeah, I think with some of the tools now that people just don't want to go back to it. I remember, my office has whiteboard paint on it, and it was always a fantastic tool being able to have a whole wall to scribble diagrams and have notes and all that. But now there's tools like Miro, which basically is very collaborative. You can actually have multiple people at the same time moving diagrams, and it's actually sometimes faster to use tools like Miro, and even though they're shared and it's very dynamic, than it is to go on a whiteboard and draw stuff around. And so I think tools like that have now caught up. I think the networking and the other technologies have caught up, and it's all real time. And so I think there's a better collaboration effort. And even if people were going to do that in the future, if everybody was back in the office, I think what you'll end up having is instead of, a whiteboard, you'll actually have a big TV screen and people will be interacting because then all of a sudden you're not bumping into each other on a whiteboard. Everyone can move it on their laptops and it'll all pop up. Everyone can see they're the same thing on their laptops on a big screen. Do you see the same thing? Do you expect the same thing to start to happen?
Yeah, I hope so, and I love those tools, and so I'm used to. I've gotten really used to using those as like a regular part of my work now. And the great thing is like you can have so many people in it. So I think the most that I've ever had on a canvas at the same time was 160. and you couldn't do that in a whiteboard in a room. And like a really cool thing is like all the facilitation things that are built into it, like voting and timers, and outline views. Like there's things that help you as a facilitator, right? So not just the experience of the people that are in it, but the people that are facilitating it. And you never have to worry about writing, do not erase this whiteboard because you've got the digital space and you can send everybody a PDF or a PNG file at the end of it. In like the reuse, so I'll find myself creating like templates for different types of agile facilitations, and you just say duplicate and just reuse and reuse and reuse. So, yeah, I think that people are, and that we'll have to figure that out. As like that means the rooms will have to have like that system that supports doing it there, and getting people in the habit of using being on their machines and using that board versus the whiteboard.
Yeah, and I think that the other aspect that's starting to happen is, and I'll compare it to developers. When we were implementing, our developer tools, we wanted to have an ID, and rather than have people jump out into Sonar Cube or Fortify or whatever other tool that we have, we ended up having all these plugins. The idea was you wanted to keep the developer within that tool and have the data right at his hand right there and then. And I think we'll actually start to see that with the collaboration. So instead of having like Slack or whatever messaging tool you might have, it's like trying to keep people within a tool or within a couple of tools, because then people don't need to be context switching in and out. And I think some of
Right.
these modern collaboration tools actually allow that to happen. And so there's a lot less context switching, which basically means a lot more focus on the subject at hand.
Yeah, I think that's an area that it's improving, but it needs to improve more because that's a tension that I hear pretty regularly to say, okay, so we're working in this OneNote, we're working in this mural, we're working on this planner or this Jira board, and they're in different places. And how do I kind of keep that all not being a confusing mess? But you're starting to see more like plugins to things where you can do it from one place. Like Slack has a ton of different plugins. The experience is not always the greatest, but I think that's going to be something that will get better. Like it's gonna have to get better.
Yeah, if we take a look at the Federal Reserve, right, it came from, a very waterfall type organization. Then it moved to an iterative with RUP kind of being rolled out across. Now we're seeing a lot more agile transformations going on. How have you been able to impact your organization, and not just your reserve bank, but also the rest of the Federal Reserve System, on getting to this agile transformation?
Yeah, I mean that is the biggest shift that's going on is that shift towards agile. And then we had been doing I'm going to air quote agile for a while, but and I think you know this as going through that journey is that it really takes a while to get there from beyond the ceremonies and structures to where you're actually living the values and principles. Those are not exactly the same thing. The space that I've spent the most time though over the last like probably about the 2 years is not necessarily agile but agility. And so taking those kind of principles and not as a software development framework or that kind of project management framework, if you will, but into extracting out those principles and applying it to these kind of new ways of working and how we work, like to almost applying it culturally to people more than processes.
Yeah, and I think that's how people are going to be successful with the big A agile, is actually not just saying it's for developers, it's actually for the whole organization. How do you actually get this into a product kind of focus, and then more into the overall how is the business, and getting into more business agile. And that gets into how is your organization structured, and organizational agility, and how are you actually be able to work with the business and transform some of the business people to be able to be successful. Because the way I see it is the business needs to transform just as much as the development and IT organization. And if they don't, improve and change how they work, then it has a very negative impact on IT organization.
Right, and it's funny because I think in the earliest days when we started going down the agile road, that's exactly the tension is that we were operating that way in the development areas, but customers weren't really used to that. They were much more used to that kind of waterfalling, saying, okay, expect we plan or we expect to have this delivery at some date in the future, and not really basing it around like sprints and incremental delivery and not always knowing what's going to ship at a time. I think that was one of the harder like mindset shifts for customers, is saying to be able to live with the cone of uncertainty and to understand because and for it not to be like our process that they were just kind of being subjected to.
Yeah, I think you get into a lot of this water scrum fall where the IT
Yeah.
organization does scrum, but the business people, yeah, I want to give you a list of my requirements and I don't want to think about it for 6 months and I expect you to come back and go, ta-da, right? And then the
Right.
IT organization goes, well, we really want to do scrum, we'll do sprints and we'll have some form of proxy for a business owner or product owner, and then we'll do the ta-da at the end, and that tends to end normally, really badly because at the end it's going, okay, you guys said you were going to be agile, but I still didn't get what I wanted. And so there's a lot, I think, of companies that's kind of their first foray into agile is a water scrum methodology. And they
Right.
normally have some disaster. And then what have you seen? What techniques have people used to actually get from a water scrum or type of organization into more of a an agile with a big A organization?
Oof, wow. So I've seen that kind of like across the spectrum, but I don't, Agile doesn't always take. I mean, there's been plays, and I think I've seen this to a degree, is where the journey will start and then you go back to the old way. I don't know that that makes it to the promised land of it working well. But you just have to go back. You've got to go back to the principles and the values of it, but get that the customer buy into it and that understanding of uncertainty and being able to accept that kind of continuous delivery towards that's continuous incremental delivery. But it's really getting to and the people on both sides, so the business side and the IT side, to really buy into that and not just do it from like ceremony.
Yeah, and speaking of ceremonies, right? I was talking last week with Mark Miller, and he is a co-author on one of the epic failures in DevOps, which is I always think is a great way to learn. Is when people have really done things really badly, had a big error, big mistake, and then they talk through how they actually what the mistake was, how they learned from it, how they changed. And one of the things that is a very common thread across them is how people have done retrospectives. And an epic failure in DevOps is just one big, multiple stories on really, really people bearing all with their retrospectives. How would you go about suggesting companies and organizations do effective team retrospectives?
Well, so there's so many different ways, like formats for doing it. But the main thing that I would say, like the best advice, is to do it. Is to do it and do it on a regular and a planned basis, and really kind of lean into it. Because if you think, I mean, so you've been around long enough when we called them lessons learned.
Yeah.
Right? So we called them lessons learned, and it was always built onto a waterfall project plan where that was something that you did at the end, and people would never plan enough time for it. Like they might say, like you have a 6 month project and they're going to have a 1 hour lessons learned session. And you never really get to where you needed to, right? So you capture some stuff and then it would never end up being anything that you would act upon. Like you wouldn't at your next project go back and look at it. So there was no, I mean, so you would capture this stuff, but in a way it was kind of theater. But when, like, if that's really working well, is that something you build in and you do really regularly? And you have to make a point to give enough time, as retrospection takes time. There's ways to kind of shortcut that. If you can, like, there's some tools out there that make it easy to do that kind of asynchronously, where you capture up people's reflections ahead of time, and nobody can see anybody else's until you get together and group them and work through it. But so there's ways to kind of shortcut how much time it spends. But The main thing is just you've got to have like that cultural or like psychological safety around retrospection to allow people to be honest and to say the kind of feedback because I mean you want to get the positive things. The positive like is that's not where the growth is. The growth is intention. And so that you've got to have like that team culture and the safety to be able to say, okay, let's be honest together so that we can grow. And then what's the move from this? But it's got to be like a regular thing. It's part of how you operate, not something you do at the end of a project.
Yeah, I always felt that lessons learned was people looking for a scapegoat, right? It was always a blame game. And the retrospective is a big shift in thinking. It's really trying to actually improve the team and the process and figuring out how to actually get better versus, being able to point fingers saying it wasn't for Jimmy, this project would have been great, right? And so and that's what lessons learned end up being, and nobody really wanted to talk through them because it was difficult conversations. I think with the retrospective, because they end up happening so much more frequently, and it's actually a much more open conversation because people actually understand the process. But it's still a shift of people's mindset. I normally
Oh,
see
big
it
time.
the first few projects, it's still a little bit of, yeah, I'm too uncomfortable really talking about the negative things. Do you see the same thing?
I do, and it's funny because I had this conversation with a couple of team members last week. So we were talking about accountability, and so the question came up is how do you get better at dealing with constructive feedback? And to me, it's reps. They're like, how does a muscle get stronger? It's repetition. It's creating so regular feedback is like the fuel of growth, and that's how you get out. Like if you do that enough, it gets people past the discomfort. But obviously you want to it needs to be collegial and respectful. Like it's not like you're bad. It's like this is the thing that went wrong, and here's what we can learn from it. But like that regular, it just has to be like on a very very regular cadence, and people will get better at it. And I think we were at the same conference. Do you remember the conference where we had the fighter pilot?
Yeah, yeah,
Anthony AB Bork, and he was talking about how at the end of missions that they all get together and they do feedback. They call it like a debrief, and all the rank comes off, and they just really kind of unpacked what went well and what didn't. But they did it at the end of every mission. So, but just that repetition of makes that stronger muscle and makes people be less uncomfortable about sharing what constructive feedback.
yeah. I think a good tool is to bring in an agile coach, and some people don't like that, but I think really as organizations are shifting to agile, and even ones that are somewhat mature in it, I think the agile coach really helps play the role because they can help get people into the repetition. How do you actually do this? How do you structure it so it's actually effective, and it just doesn't become rote and people just go,
Hmm.
"Oh, it's a ceremony and I have to do it and I'll write it down and never worry about it." And that is kind of the defeats the purpose of doing any of these practices if it's just a ceremony just because, right? And I think
Yeah.
this is where agile coaches can really come in and help. Have you employed agile coaches in your organization?
Yeah, we're in fact. So we that's kind of a structure that we're creating. So part of what we're doing on Org Agility is building out that kind of coaching capability across the organization. In the way that so that way we're able to have people coach in other groups because I think like the point that you were getting to there was about having that kind of that disinterested third party that doesn't necessarily have any skin in the game. I think it's easier for them to provide that space, like that open space for constructive feedback, than somebody that's on the team. And so yeah, so we've been building out that capability just across the organization so that more than just so that it's just not bound in a team. And so
Yeah.
I do a fair amount of work like that. So pretty much all the retrospectives that I do are not in my own group.
Yeah, and I think that's a sign of the level of management maturity and buy-in to the agile process because it's very easy to say, well, we sent everybody to agile training, they're all Scrum certified, Therefore, we can take that budget line item for the coach or coaches and get rid of it because it's really seen as a cost center. I actually see it as a way of really streamlining, making ourselves more efficient, and it actually brings a lot more value to the table than a lot of people realize, just because the consistency and the formality that it brings to the table.
Yeah, I think that you hit a really good point in there too. Is that I do think it really helps to kind of, at a minimum, have like a baseline level of those competencies pretty much on anybody that's going to be like you want to teach them about those principles and practices, even if that's not like their full time gig, but just so that they understand what's behind it. Um, and just to make people more flexible, because one of the things we kind of describe that as like T-shaped people, to where so you think about me like as a T-shaped person, my tall T, like the tall bar, is architecture, right? So I'm a software architect, but then there's these other things like coaching, leadership, project management, those kind of other things that are supportive of the main, rather than just having people that are kind of like monoliths.
Yeah, and I think culture is probably one of the big aspects of digital transformation and changing the culture. And when I was at the Federal Reserve of New York, right, we had a big shift in common services. Common services really trying to raise the bar, and then we put together a training program. If you remember, Common Services University, that tried to standardize not only on the technical pieces of, from an architecture of here's our reference architecture, here's our solution patterns. We actually had a demo application called Hamilton Bank that we actually had developers train on. But I thought it was even more important was how we actually thought about the culture and how we actually train people and thought through the culture, especially as you get to more agile and eventually towards a DevOps type of organization where you're pulling in a lot more groups, a lot tighter than ever before. Have you seen the same thing with culture, and how do you go about doing this cultural transformation as part of your organizational agility?
Well, so the cultural part of it, and it's funny because I saw an article today about that was talking about digital transformation and just the array of things that go along with it. That it's not just about technology. So it's about that the intersection of people and culture, technology, process, and so you just have to really kind of pay attention to those intersectional points and kind of get past the traditional ways that we interacted, and how you kind of meet and engage teams. But so what we've been doing is like, so you train people on the different principles and practices in it, and then kind of send them out there to to learn by doing. So doing different types of facilitations, kind of rotating the wheel there, where you can work your way around learning different things.
Yeah, I think with Agile, you get very much into trying to reduce the sheer number of different resources by having a lot more compact team. Before I always remember, well, you have to have a security person. Well, you can't afford one full time on a project, so it's got to be a third of a security person, a quarter of a tester, a fifth of an operations person. You got to have a little bit of a scrum master. Oh, well, we can't have 50% of a scrum master. We can't fund that. It's only going to be 20%. And then, etc., etc. A separate UI person, separate Java person, separate database person. Oh, we're going to install this on a server, so you need a server person. Oh, well, we have some middleware. We're going to have a middleware person, etc., etc., etc. Now with Agile, and I think even with the cloud adoption, you say everything really is a lot more code orientated. So we only need a few more developers, right? And Java developers, if you're doing something transactional, well, they might also code up some of the test cases. They might actually write your Terraform script to configure your infrastructure. Are you seeing that kind of cross discipline actually helping people understand the problem better versus throwing it over the fence to security or operations?
Yes, and I think you hit on something there too. So around with the cloud really kind of brings those opportunities up, since really kind of everything is code. So configuration is code, infrastructure is code, and like the tightening of the tool chain. So there's like less of those throw it over the wall handoffs kind of going on. And it's interesting to see kind of the roles and responsibilities change when the difference between when you're hosting all your own pieces versus when you're in somebody else's thing, and it's all configuration driven or code driven versus settings driven, I guess, where your people have people turning knobs. But I see it play out differently, and I don't know exactly like I don't know that there's a one size fits all pattern, because in bigger organizations have enough people that they can do those more kind of traditional teamings that you kind of had described. But in smaller places, you end up essentially distributing people across multiple teams. Um,
Yeah, I actually impacted by that as we speak, right? So I came from a very large organization that actually had a national IT group, so we didn't have to worry too much about the underlying infrastructure. Now I'm in a lot smaller organization, and so it's really a matter of, okay, well, we don't have this hidden kind of national IT group that worries about the network and the firewall and the servers and the patching. We're much more closer to that. So I couldn't agree more that it's not a one size fits all. But I certainly see that with some of these technologies, such as cloud and more of the infrastructure or everything as code, yeah, it's a lot more tightly bound together. And I think that just improves overall. Uh,
I think that like kind of the cool part of that though is the way the tool chain works is almost I in my head I'm kind of thinking about like it's almost like a retro when you have your tool chain and everything's infrastructure is code. You've created almost like a retrospective, this constant feedback loop of the tools telling you like what's going on, and whether something worked, whether something didn't, um, like in kind of pretty much real time,
yeah,
versus
no,
the way there used to be these like big switchovers. It's
right.
just that CI/CD really gives you a lot more like almost continuous feedback on what's going on in your process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The other thing that I see with on the culture is actually people changing roles. So I've done it where a team will actually take the role of the Scrum Master and over time rotate it between team members so everyone gets the chance to be a Scrum Master, understand what that role is, and that helps people with the career. Is that maybe a path I want to go? Also, we try to rotate people between, hey, your primary focus is development. Maybe you want to do testing. Maybe you actually want to help drive some of the business requirements and work very closely with the business. Are you starting to do the same kind of thing in your teams?
We are doing some things like that. So in the so what we'll do around facilitations is giving everybody a shot. So let's say that you have a regular steering meeting. That's part of your team kind of like operating rhythm. Is rotating the person that's a facilitator maybe a month at a time to give everybody an opportunity to lead in that structure. But we're kind of doing this a little around tooling too. So since with the kind of emergence of the no code and low code platforms, is it opens up to different levels of people that are in that development sphere. So you can like if you're doing say C# or Java, that's a really specialized thing that takes a lot of like time and training and experience to get really good at. And so it's very specialized. But with these newer platforms and even some of the stuff like so no code and low code and like some of the BI things, is really it's a broad spectrum of people that can do it. And so we're having more of that kind of stuff, and like the tooling. If you look at some of the newer stuff, or like robotic process automation, that's a thing that's very approachable to most people, unless you get into something really complicated. So
Right.
there's a lot of things that like you don't necessarily need an enterprise developer to do, and so it makes it much easier to kind of rotate people through. It makes it easier to kind of like not just have it be an enterprise dev. It could be somebody anywhere on that spectrum. And what
Yeah.
I found is that even interns, like we've, so I kind of run our intern program, and what I've noticed is just with the newer tools, is they're so quick on the uptake. So it's not like dropping them in and hey, you're having to do C++ or something. When these newer tools, I mean, have had really good success with even second year college students like coming in and just really picking it up.
Yeah, I think that's probably a great competitive advantage, right? There is a huge need for talent in development and technical resources. And in New York, it's exacerbated, right? There's just so much demand in New York. Certain other places as well are seeing huge demand. And now with COVID, I think the demand is just across the U.S. because so many companies are just hiring, and I think you know again when I was at New York Fed, we had a big intern program because we were competing against Google, Facebook, any of the fintechs up and coming in New York that were very attractive and sexier. It's one thing to say, oh well, we work for this pseudo government kind of agency doing really cool things. But it was great to actually get the interns, and we started getting them as second years because we could keep them coming back. And then the best option that we had was, well, we'll hire you every summer. You'll go through the intern program, but we really like it if you're a local person and you could work for us 1 day a week as a contractor because it just keeps them warm and they get to know us and they can understand much better what the mission is, because once people really understand the mission, there is a passion, right? We really are fundamental to the United States and to the globe, and working on some of the key systems, whether it's Fedwire of the world or whether it's common code that's used in many applications or bank supervision or the treasury systems, people will get really bought into the mission, and it's noble. It's a noble cause. But it takes a while for people to really understand what we do. So how are you attracting staff and talent to your organization?
Well, it's one, I've got like an amazing partner in our recruiting group. Like she's unbelievable, like highly dynamic. But really, kind of what you hit it is we very much lead with the mission, and we're not like so. There's certain people that we're just not going to get right. So if you're interested in skateboarding and down the halls and ping pong and things like that in the office, like that's not who we're going to attract. We attract people who really have an interest in. So I always really lead with explaining our public mission and how important that is, and it attracts the kind of folks that want to be there. But we really haven't had. I wouldn't say we've had difficulty in attracting talent. We're getting the people that our mission is appealing to.
No, that's great, and it's great to hear that you have that whole process. I think a lot of organizations, it's a lot more random, and maybe even by line of business, by line of business. It's nice if it's a coordinated effort.
Yeah,
So
there was something that you said in there though that kind of landed with me about demand. And so that's one of the things that I really see is, and I don't think that that's going to like it's one of those things that's only going to get higher is that demand for technology services, because that hockey stick just keeps continuing, and so that's really the big challenge that we're all working on is how do we increase our capacity, because if you can kind of assume our budgets don't get to go up, so how do we get more capacity and how do we deliver more value um, with this just increasing need, because the demand is never really going to go down. Like
yeah,
that's the chronic problem.
yeah, and it's an interesting problem, and I think some of the market with the no code or low code platforms are helping that because I was talking to a friend a couple of weeks ago, and what they were struggling with is they have what they consider a legacy organization, right? So they had a lot of people that were doing mainframe development, they were doing cold fusion development, and they were doing other types of development, and they were struggling to get over to the Java world or C Sharp world. They just couldn't, wrap their heads around some of the object orientation or the massive kind of libraries that are out there. And they were very much successful in getting these people because they had a discipline of thinking, right? And they basically trained them up on some of the top no code, really the low code platforms. And they actually, saw an extra life. They were actually being able to be very effective in implementing that, because with there, it really was a lot of the business knowledge that made them very valuable, the structured thinking to how to analyze a problem, and then with very little coding and quite a bit of training, they were actually to be very effective and add value, and they got basically a new lease on life, and basically it stopped them having to go out and hire additional staff because of that. Are you seeing some of that with the transformation? Are you bringing in some of the either no code, or I really prefer the low code because you always get these edge cases and you just have to write some code?
Yeah, so far I haven't seen anything that's been a no code. So there's always, that's always part of, like we
Right.
say, low code, no code. But so far I have not seen a thing that didn't have any code. There's always something. Um, but that said, yeah, so that's a place that I'm really encouraged by, because and you remember back, like, rewind 20 years ago, how there were some of these products that were a promise of that, but they never, like, the demos were amazing, and then you'd get the thing and it just didn't work, right? It just, like, flat didn't work. The platforms now, it works. It really works. My first experience with it was, taking what was, so a .NET app on C Sharp, essentially like a headless type of app, um, that just a given module of that took a developer about 2 months to write. Um, and that same thing that took them 2 months to write, and it was the whole thing, and it was what, a couple thousand lines of code. I was able to do that in a low code, no code platform in about 4 hours.
Right. Yeah.
And so there was minimal amount of coding in it, but just um, you know, and I'm a manager, I guess, and was able to do that. So I don't get to develop as much as I would like to, but even me, as not in the weeds of code every day, was able to knock it out that quickly. So think about what, somebody who gets to develop more often, just how powerful that becomes. And I think you can kind of create this. There's places in no code, low code that a citizen developer or a business line developer that has enough training can really crank out a lot of great solutions. And if they get to a place where they need something, maybe they need a custom connector into a legacy system, then you pull in your enterprise developer to kind of fill in that gap and create that reusable piece. But see, I kind of feel like that's where that capacity is going to come from to meet the demand, is by shifting as much stuff that you can over to those no code, low code. There's some other technologies that are coming too, like some very interesting things in the analytics space around. I call it data scientists in a box.
Right.
But so it's those kind of more like automated machine learning, or like if Clippy were a data scientist, following through a wizard, but if you look at it, I mean, a lot of it's good enough that it can create really great business insights. Not to the level of somebody like a data scientist that's getting in the weeds with TensorFlow, right?
Right.
But really, for solving general purpose business problems, it's really effective. And so I think that's where we're going to get some of that capacity back,
Yeah.
is in
I
not having to get in the weeds.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because the way I'm seeing it is, we're now got, especially on the data science and business intelligence platforms, just about everybody that's coming out of school seems to know Python, right, on the data that you're hiring. So all of a sudden now, instead of, having somebody that didn't know how to code, actually understands, how to query these data sets automatically, because that's what they did in school. And then they're used to doing Python. So all of a sudden now, there's a lot more bleeding, or where the business is actually a lot more technically advanced. And so they can take some of the low hanging fruit problems and actually develop solutions for them using whatever platform that you're offering. You just need to put the right set of controls. I've seen in the past where people develop Python on their laptops. There were, business developers, right? And then they go and quit, and some of these models were on their laptop, and well, IT takes the laptop and wipes it, and all of a sudden all of that code and all of these models and data sets uh, were wiped. And so it's just having the right controls and putting the right tools in their hands. But I think that's going to be a huge shift. Uh, we've seen it really in the data space very aggressively. We used to generate reports. Now it's going to be okay. We'll give you access to Tableau or whatever reporting tool that you want, Looker or whatever. Or now there's more advanced tools that even business people are using, like Alteryx is a good example of these tools that are getting rolled out. And really, it's still pretty much plug and play, simple application development going on, some simple Python you can start to use. And it just really shows you the value now that since everyone's getting that level of technology proficient, it allows, IT to focus on even higher value add work. Are you
Right.
seeing the same thing?
I am, and the thing the challenge though that it opens up is it's like you said about when there's things like somebody had things on their laptop and the laptop got wiped, but so making sure protecting those assets and coming up with that like governance structure around it to make sure that things are done in a way that's not increasing risk.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and sprawl like so I think that's going to be so that's the to me that's like one of the challenge of citizen developers and no code low code is if you don't have like governance gating around it to kind of you'll end up with a ton of sprawl because people can and so
Yeah,
you
well,
want to have like, what can you put in place to make sure that people aren't doing redundant work, how do you expose the work of others so that it might be reused,
well,
that
I
kind of
think
thing.
every large company has a sprawl problem, especially
Yeah.
with unstructured documents. The perfect example, everyone has share drives, right? And then,
Right.
well, we're going to get SharePoint, and SharePoint's going to solve our share drive problem. And then what they found out after a couple of years is, well, our share drives are still growing, and now we have this massive
Right.
SharePoint problem. And then IT goes, well, we've got this tool, and this time this will solve our problem. And the problem is just the sheer amount of data, and then how do you actually structure that data and classify that data to be able to find it. And I think unstructured is probably the biggest nightmare that most large organizations have, just because the sheer volume and the constant growth. Are you seeing that type of problem?
Definitely, and I think that's like one of the so besides cloud is like thinking the big problems or big initiatives that we're all dealing with. Data management and records and information management are really big, like that kind of sprawl. But I think that's where when you start thinking about digital transformation as a thing, that's where the opportunity for improvement is because for so long we've essentially just kind of kicked this problem down the field, and maybe it was because that all the tools weren't there to do it in kind of a mindful way, but there's always that pressure about like how quickly to do something, when sometimes the right thing to do is just say, okay, let's be a little more thoughtful about this to make sure we're making the right decisions and not taking a bad process and moving it to another tool. It's like,
Exactly. So one of the other aspects of digital transformation is really looking at yourself, right? And there's a phrase that a friend said, "Hey, you got to think about hacking yourself. How do you do self improvement? What are you doing on how to improve yourself, how to improve how you're effective and the way that you work? Can you give some people some insights on changes that you've made to make yourself more effective?"
as a career IT person, I think like the biggest change I've made over the last couple of years is spending more time investing on the people side of competencies. So emotional intelligence, empathy, things like that, and trying to create a toolbox for myself to be more connected with like our business users or like those customers, and really understand it from their perspective rather than just thinking about systems. Think in terms of what problems are they trying to solve, um, but in keeping up with learning, like you constantly got to keep up with learning. but just adjusting to how the pace of change changes the way that we learn and when we need to learn things. Is because if you think about the old model of I'm going to go spend 5 days off site for a C# class, and that now things change so quickly, and those are expensive classes, but things change so quickly that a quarter after you've been to it, so much of that stuff has changed, and it's almost like when we used to buy big programming books,
Right.
and so you just have to switch to more like micro learning, and more kind of being more experimental, and rather than learning big monolithic things, is doing kind of smaller just in time things.
Yeah, that's
Just to
a
keep up.
yeah, yeah. You got to. It's always a struggle to keep up, and just now there's so many different sources of ways of finding out information and ways, and it becomes a little bit addicting. I find of, oh, look, there's something new in JavaScript, and yeah, I haven't written JavaScript in a while, but it's like, oh, a new framework. Let me read up about that, right? So it's very much a, where's the shiny coin all over the place. So that's always
Yeah,
a
avoid
struggle.
that.
Yeah, yeah. I think everyone struggles with that. The other point that you made is very interesting, and it's got to be hard for you as just a career IT person, especially in architecture, is trying to understand the customer's problem. I was on a call today, and we just had the team had this knee-jerk reaction where we were going through some of the stories, some of the requirements that the customer wanted, and all of a sudden, 10 seconds later, we were trying to solution it, and we just naturally jump into, well, we've got to worry about this and this account structure, and what happens if we have two accounts, and it's like, no, guy, we need to back up and really talk about the end user and not worry about the tactical, and it's a huge pull to get back up and to keep the conversation focused on what the business wants versus trying to in your back of your head going, well, here's a way I can do it this way, I can do it this way. Oh, we haven't done this would be cool to go and achieve. What tools do you use to avoid getting into this trap? Because I'm sure you just want to get in there and architect.
Right. And it's funny though, because I think that you just described like almost every single IT person is really quickly like we hear problems. We're problem solvers,
Right.
right? We immediately jump into that. Let's jump into the solution space. But really, the better move is to like pause. So I guess my biggest tool there is to try to interject, like to include a mindful pause and ask more questions. Is like ask more questions and try to ask questions that represent like their perspective. Um, there's techniques that you can use to kind of like it's one from couples counseling. It's called the couples dialogue, and it's incredibly effective. Because when someone essentially presents their problem to you, is like reading it back to them, right? With a little bit of paraphrasing, but just to make sure that you really understand it, and then verifying that you got it right. So that's a way of like creating understanding, creating that kind of pause in there. But just you've got to step into their space and make sure that you understand. And I really I struggle with that all the time because I definitely like let's jump to solving problems, and you immediately as an architect too, like as an architect, part of your toolbox are reusable patterns. It's reusable problems that you've solved in the past. And so you're always trying to pull, like you hear a problem and you say, okay, here's a solution I've done before. So you're immediately plugging blocks in when the real move is to like slow down and really make sure that you understand before you start to solutioning.
Yeah, I think you've got a good white paper there, couples therapy applied to requirements gathering. So it'll be interesting reading once you've written that. So the other, to kind of try and wrap up, right? This whole digital transformation is a very big change journey, and there's always these bumps in the road, and it's never a straight line. It'd be easy to say, yep, we're there. It's 15 miles up the road. It tends to be much more zigs and zags. Can you maybe give some of the people some insights into some of the zigs and zags that you've seen, and some of the areas that people should be focusing on as they go through this whole digital transformation journey?
So, I mean, I guess my best response to that would be is to I'll think of it like as a user experience journey, and as much as possible try to um, be adaptive and responsive as you go along and learn. I kind of think as I've been playing with this model, so I'm a ProSci organizational change management practitioner, and they have this way they kind of represent the difference between project management and change management, and I look at that model and I think it's actually missing a thing, and what the bubble that I consider there, it's I call it either like complexity management or sense making, and that's so, and think of it as a Venn diagram, they all kind of touch one another, but just really paying attention on the journey and building in that retrospection time and adjusting, experiment, adjust, experiment, retrospect, adjust, and taking things into those smaller bite-sized kind of pieces and learn as you go along, rather than trying to build toward like plan everything super in advance, and then building towards like a big monolithic solution. Is just break it down into smaller kind of chunks.
Okay, just want to, I think we're about out of time, so I just want to say thanks very much, Sean. Really appreciate your insights. It's good seeing you, and maybe hopefully this year we'll actually get to meet again face to face. Now that travel restrictions seems to be coming up, I think it'll all be good. So, any maybe last parting thoughts for people?
I'm looking forward to getting vaccinated.
Okay.
That's a dream, is to be vaccinated on a beach in Mexico having beach drinks.
Thanks, Sean. Bye.